Hi everyone, my name's Abby and this is my Teach the Article presentation. I'm just going to pull it up and share my screen and then I'll get started. Okay, so my article is called Reclaiming the White Daughter's Purity, Afrikaner Nationalism, Racialized Sexuality, and the 1975 Abortion and Sterilization Act in Apartheid South Africa. And it was written by Suzanne Clausen. So to start off with a summary, the act examines the struggle over abortion law reform that preceded the enactment of the 1975 Abortion and Sterilization Act. So kind of how it led up to that point. The law itself made it so on-demand abortions were not available. After many revisions, it became so that they could be performed in very particular instances. So if it was going to be detrimental to the women's physical or mental health or the babies, but even still, they would have to receive 2 signatures signing off on it from 2 different doctors. So it was also done to prevent young unmarried white women from engaging in premarital sexual activity. The ruling National Party government produced this legislation to do that, as well as eliminating access to doctors who were willing to perform abortions. So they made it very difficult to get to the steps that would allow for these abortions to happen. They knowingly condemned an estimated 200,000 women annually to the underground world of clandestine abortions. So that would be the abortions that took place from traditional healers that would give women drugs or herbs to drink and make them very sick, sometimes even leading to death. Bleeding out happened often. They may use sticks, leaves, knitting needles to try to have the abortion. They would even drink toxic liquids such as Dettol, which is an antiseptic that is really, really dangerous. And along with that, this article also talks about just the disregard for the plight of African women and this idea that African women were naturally more promiscuous, the stereotype that we've heard about where they're more exotic, they're more sexual, and that there was no point in trying to save them from this world of promiscuity. But the white women aren't naturally like this, so they could be saved if laws were put into place such as this that wouldn't allow them to act in that kind of manner. A quote I pulled from the article is that African women were naturally suited to the world of sexual promiscuity and therefore did not require the same paternalistic protection as young white women. So that was kind of the idea that the government leaders had going into this piece of legislation. And it was also really the first piece of law that South Africa made in terms of abortion. So then regulation of sexuality in apartheid. So this is just kind of a bit of a timeline. So obviously it's established after World War II, and regulation of sexuality was fundamental to its development. It really is weaved into how the government controlled their people. So the Prohibition of Mixed Marriages Act, that was in 1949, and that made it so white and Black individuals could not be married. It was criminalized. And then the Immortality Act made it so there could be no transracial sexual relations between white people and those of other races. So that just kind of like sets the stage of the attitude towards controlling sexuality. And then there's also this idea of the Volksmutter, which I don't know if I'm saying that right, but basically it's the mother of the race or nation. So it's this idea of a self-sacrificing wife who deferred to her husband and fulfilled her racial and national duty to produce Volk, or children that would go on and do the same. So it's this idea that like, if I'm the perfect wife and I'm the perfect mother, then I'll make these perfect children who are going to carry these white supremacist ideas, essentially. And to give more context, there was a fear of the white minority being swamped, is the word that the author uses. So the population for the white minority in South Africa in the 1970s dropped to 17.3%. And that was scary to the leaders because, as this typically happens, those are in the majority tend to get power and they didn't want that to happen. So they pretty much used this abortion as population control. And then along with that, there was the sterilization, so the Depo-Provera. With this overpopulation, that they thought was happening with the African individuals. There was an injectable contraceptive, the Depo-Provera, and it's an unknown number of Black women who were infected without knowledge or consent. So they were forced to be sterilized. This idea that, if we're not allowing white women to have abortions, then we'll have a bigger population and more of these model citizens can live. And then if we don't care about what the African women are doing, chances are they're not going to make it through whatever unsafe practices they're going through. So it didn't matter. And along with that, there was this kind of change in the air that I'll go into more on the next slide, but specifically, the young white women were no longer fearful of humiliation from pregnancy. That was a big chunk of the article, how in the past, before contraception, there's, like the scarlet letter idea where you'll be shunned in public if you're pregnant before you're married, and the kind of Christian ideal that this society held of like the Virgin Mary type of woman. But now that there's options that you don't have to keep it, you can take a pill and it's gone the next day. There's no more fear of being promiscuous. So women are going out and exploring their sexuality more at earlier ages because there's not a consequence of having to keep the baby. So the South African leaders did not care for that. And that kind of comes along with why they were trying to basically ban abortion. So how this intervenes into civil rights, the author specifically says there was an intent on distancing South Africa from the immortality of the West. So as we know, during the 1970s, there's kind of this sexual liberation for women. It's included in second wave feminism. So the first wave, it's more about the suffragettes, it's about voting, it's about really minimal sort of things. And then this wave that comes through in the 60s through into the early 80s really is more about like sexual freedom and owning yourself as a woman and those types of senses. So I kind of just wanted to lay out a few key parts of the timeline to kind of help understand why this act came at that time. So two examples of literature that were really prominent were The Feminine Mystique and Sexual Politics. So The Feminine Mystique is by Betty Friedan, and it pretty much contested the post-World War II belief that a woman's job was to marry and have children. So that became really popular, and a lot of women were now hearing this other side of what it could be like in their life if they didn't choose that sort of role. And then Sexual Politics came out in 1970, and this was Kate Millett's PhD dissertation, and it's an analysis on male authors and the way that they write women in literature and how that can be affected by patriarchal notions and why we need to understand what they are and do away with them. And then kind of the next piece in the US is Title VII of the Civil Rights Act. So that was 1964. And this is what made it, you could not discriminate against religion, race, sex, gender, that sort of thing. And then on a bit more of a global scale, the Abortion Act in 1967 made it so women could get an abortion up to 24 weeks, still with that two consenting doctors agreeing that if they wanted to go after that, it would be because the pregnancy would be harmful to the baby or the woman. And then there's also the first WLM conference in 1970 in England. So that's the Women's Liberation Conference. It was held in Oxford, and about 600 plus women came to discuss things like equal pay, education, job opportunities, free contraception and abortion on demand, and much more. So it's kind of one of the, not one of the first times, but one of a very big global scale time of women coming together to talk about these newer ideas. We had Seneca Falls, and now there's the WLM conference where we're talking about bigger things than just voting. Things like reproductive justice and that sort of thing. And then obviously Roe v. Wade, which is just a huge landmark case in terms of abortion. So that ruled through the Supreme Court, a woman's right to an abortion was protected by the 14th Amendment. And then to kind of put it in perspective of women of color, and specifically the African women, there's the National Black Feminist Organization that's formed in 1973. And they were committed to the struggle against racial, sexual, heterosexual, and upper class oppression. So that was their main focus for their group. And then how it fits into today's civil rights, there's still issues with politicizing sexuality in the female body. What's happening in Texas is exactly what I'm talking about. So the Texas abortion law that's made 2021, news articles are coming out as we speak about it. It essentially is a bill that bans abortion after an ultrasound if the ultrasound can detect a fetal heartbeat, which can be as early as 6 weeks. And then there are exceptions with medical reasons, but it's really a wishy-washy law, because what is a heartbeat can be debated. Some medical professionals are saying that it's not going to be accurate. Sometimes women don't even know they're pregnant at that point. So it's clear that there's definitely an intervention into civil rights, and it's still here today in 2021. So the key arguments the author makes, her main thesis is that this law was passed to buttress heteropatriarchal apartheid culture. So what I took from that is it was kind of made to further these ideals that were being pressed by the political leaders, to make their society what they wanted to be and what they believed would be the most prosperous through really white nationalism and just fear. So it was a society that racialized sexuality, and it made it so stereotypes could be perpetuated about African women, how they're overly sexual and not worth protecting, unlike the white woman, who aren't meant to act this way. They've been strayed by these Western ideas that are, polluting their brains. And then it also is an example of the impact and importance of increased globalized communication of ideas and campaigns and policies specifically about reproduction during this time. So when in the US, we're having giant protests for women's rights and reproductive justice, and things are much more widespread, they're on the news or on the radio, you can visually see and hear what's happening around you. It really shows how that can affect what other countries decide to do in terms of legislation. And then also it placing a national narrative of reproductive policies onto an international context can provide insights on the motives and influences of those involved. So it kind of gives reasons to why the leaders are acting this way, because we see what they're seeing, and it kind of takes one instance and how it affects so much more, and the global scale that reproductive policies really have. And then just kind of a quote that I took that I think kind of summarizes that is, the apartheid body was sexualized, racialized, and gendered in complex and interlocking and interdependent ways. So then the most interesting parts to me was the focus that was put on regulating white women and the blatant disrespect for African women. Before reading this, the title kind of struck me because I was a little bit confused on what they meant by the specifically reclaiming the white daughter. But I was kind of shocked to see how much stress was put on this protection of white women, and how they needed to be fixed, while the African women were left to die, essentially. And there's not much care for them, but there's all this effort getting put into controlling the white women's bodies, which thus is even more controlling of what Black women can and can't do, because they don't even get the options, and they're not even a part of the laws that are getting passed. Another thing that I found interesting was how much more recent this is than I assumed. I mean, when you look at the year 1975, like, my parents were growing up. There's people who are very much still alive from this time. So I think sometimes when we learn about history and these types of events, we think, oh my God, that was years ago, or like, that was way before me. It really wasn't that long ago. Like, this is very relevant. And then the next thing that I found interesting was that women were put against each other, like how much this apartheid society forced this white woman versus African woman narrative of like, you're worth more than getting an abortion, and keep your children and raise them to be model citizens, but we don't really care what you do with your kids because we don't want them anyways. And we don't care what happens to your body either, but we want to protect your body by not letting you do what you want with it. It's this weird kind of like dualism, and I'm not sure if that's the right word, but like the way that they're paired against each other. And the author states it really nice through the trope was key to demarcating the boundary between civilized white rulers and barbarous ruled. So it's like how we treat each group and what we think each group deserves. And this group deserves an intense amount of legislation not allowing them what to do, and they deserve absolutely nothing, thus not letting them do anything safe. So that's what I found to be really interesting, and interesting in a way that it's like very disturbing. Which it was hard to read, but extremely informative. And then kind of leading into my discussion question, how does politicizing a woman's choice for abortion affect society as a whole? I wanted to talk about this because I wanted to kind of bring it back into 2021. And I figured with these laws in Texas, this is kind of an interesting thing that hasn't gone away. And I don't know if it's ever going to. And then in what other areas of South African life does this affect? And how does it allow for these political leaders to gain power over their people? And so then these are my works cited. Yeah, and thank you for watching.